The quarterly strategy meeting was halfway through in our Chicago headquarters when Brooke Dalton cut off the budget review, lifted her chin at the end of the table, and dismissed me like I was a scheduling error. I stayed still, one hand resting over my notebook. While the room went so quiet I could hear the legal counsel stop turning pages and somebody near the windows miss a breath. Then Brooke leaned forward and made it uglier, saying HR already had my paperwork ready, saying I needed to clear my office before the end of the day, saying it with the confidence of a woman who thought borrowed authority was the same thing as power. I turned to my husband, because Grant Holloway was still sitting at the head of that table, hands folded, eyes lowered, wearing the kind of silence that only exists when a betrayal has already been rehearsed. He did not interrupt her, did not correct her title, did not say my name. And that absence landed harder than any public insult, because it told me he had known exactly how this morning would unfold. Brooke caught the glance and smiled like she had been waiting for it, then said his decision was final too. And the moment those words left her mouth, I understood she had not stumbled into an affair. She had stepped into a plan. I rose slowly, smoothed the front of my skirt, and looked at Grant first, because I wanted him to feel the weight of being seen before I gave the room anything else. "Honey," I said, quiet enough that everyone leaned in anyway. "Your mistress is feeling very bold today." And the color dropped out of Brooke's face so fast it almost made the sentence sound merciful. Grant finally looked up. Brooke started choking on denials about professionalism, and I let both of them freeze in the proof of their own panic before I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you sure you have the authority to fire me?" Brooke answered too quickly, saying she had every right to remove a program director. And that was when I gave her the mistake she had earned. I asked whether an executive officer also had the authority to remove the chair of the board. And the room did not react all at once, because shock like that never moves in a straight line. By the time I called Maren Blake and told her to notify the directors of an emergency meeting in 30 minutes, Brooke was staring at me like the floor had disappeared under her heels. And Grant looked like he finally understood that silence had just cost him everything. I left the boardroom without breaking stride because Brooke had already done the useful part for me, and Maren Blake was waiting upstairs with the emergency packet prepared. The chairman's suite sat above the executive floors like a place the building remembered, even when people inside it preferred convenient myths over documented control. When Maren handed me the folder and murmured that every director had been notified under the bylaws, I finally felt the morning settle into its true shape. I crossed to the desk, set down my notebook, and opened the trust file that had protected me for years without ever needing to announce itself. The proof was not sentimental, not buried in family gossip, and not open to interpretation, because the controlling voting interest had remained inside the Foster Trust the entire time. Grant had always possessed a title, a salary, and the illusion of inheritance. But the actual authority rested where his family had hoped nobody would force them to point. The door swung open before I could sit, and Brooke came in carrying the same arrogance she had worn downstairs, except now it shook around the edges. She demanded an explanation, demanded to know on what grounds I had interrupted her authority, and I told her I controlled 51% through the founding trust and had for years. She stared at me, then reached instinctively for Grant's name, insisting he would have told her if that were true. And that was when her confidence finally started collapsing. I stepped closer and let her see that I was not improvising, then said quietly that if Grant had told her the truth, he never could have used her. That landed harder than the number itself, because humiliation moves faster than fear when a woman realizes the man beside her never considered her important enough for honesty. By the time footsteps started gathering beyond the suite, Brooke was no longer standing there like the woman who had fired me, just the woman who had finally learned whose name she had tried to erase. Grant came in only after Brooke left, closing the door behind him with the careful control of a man, still hoping tone could rescue what facts had already destroyed. He asked for privacy, like the suite was not already private, like the morning could still be folded into a marital disagreement instead of the failed ambush it had plainly become. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the trust file, and watched him choose his first lie, telling me I was making this bigger than it needed to be. I opened the folder on my desk and slid the first document toward him. The draft transition memo listing my removal before Brooke ever stood up downstairs. His eyes dropped to the page, then lifted too fast, and that tiny break in rhythm told me more than any denial could have managed. I placed a second document beside it, the meeting request showing he and Brooke had met with outside counsel 2 nights earlier, without board authorization, then asked whether this still looked sudden. He tried to pivot, saying none of it meant what I thought, saying Brooke had overstepped, saying we could still contain the damage if I stopped acting emotionally. I pulled the recorder from the desk drawer, pressed play, and let his own voice fill the room, calm and unmistakable, explaining that once I was forced out, the trust would be easier to pressure. He went completely still at the sound of himself, because conspiracy stops feeling abstract the moment it speaks back in your own tone. When the recording ended, he did not deny it right away, which mattered more to me than any excuse he might have rushed into afterward. He looked tired before he looked ashamed, and that was how I knew greed had been driving him longer than guilt ever would. I told him this was no longer a feeling, no longer a suspicion, no longer a wife noticing distance in her marriage, because it was now a sequence of documents, dates, and his own recorded intention. He asked what I wanted as if that question belonged to him, and I answered with the only 2 choices he had left. He could resign voluntarily, surrender his executive authority, and let counsel structure an orderly exit, or he could stay seated until the board removed him in full view of the record. By the time footsteps began gathering outside for the emergency meeting, Grant was no longer facing a wife he had underestimated, only the evidence he had built with his own hands. By the time I entered the emergency board meeting, every seat around that long walnut table was filled, and the room had already separated itself into caution, fear, and calculation. No one asked why I took the chair at the head because the packet Marin had distributed before they arrived had answered that question more cleanly than any introduction. Grant remained standing near the far end with the fixed expression of a man still hoping procedure might slow down consequences he had already set in motion. I did not ask anyone to care about my marriage, my humiliation, or the theater Brooke had staged downstairs, because none of that was the issue before us now. I opened the meeting by directing outside counsel to confirm the bylaws, the emergency notice, and the controlling voting structure, and each answer landed exactly where it needed to. Once counsel confirmed that I held majority voting authority through the Foster Trust and that the session was properly constituted, the room stopped pretending this was a domestic misunderstanding. Grant tried to recast everything as a personal conflict, insisting that private tension had been dragged into governance, but I slid the documents forward before the sentence finished breathing. The transition memo with my removal already drafted, the unauthorized meeting with outside counsel, and the recording of his plan to pressure the trust were enough to shift the room from discomfort into risk assessment. I told them plainly that a chief executive attempting to remove the controlling stakeholder through deception, while empowering a romantic partner to execute the move, was not a personal matter but a fiduciary one. That changed the rhythm immediately because directors who might ignore betrayal do not ignore exposure, donor instability, manipulated records, or the possibility of litigation tied directly to executive misconduct. I did not ask them to choose me over Grant, only to choose whether the organization would be governed by evidence or by the private appetites of a man who had confused access with ownership. When the first director moved to suspend Grant's executive authority pending removal, the second followed, then the third, and by the time the formal vote carried, his title was gone. His system access was frozen, and the first official blow had landed exactly where it belonged. The backlash started before the board vote had even finished circulating through the building, which told me Judith Holloway had moved faster than grief and cleaner than panic. By early afternoon, Piper Sloane was already online with wet eyes, a shaken voice, and a story polished enough to sound spontaneous, calling me ruthless, ungrateful, and power-hungry. She claimed I had stripped Grant of his family legacy, turned a private disagreement into a public execution, and pushed an old woman out of her home as if cruelty were my first language. I listened once, then set the phone down, because the useful part was not her performance, but the certainty that she had repeated details no outsider should have possessed. Minutes later, Judith called me herself, skipping outrage and going straight to negotiation, urging me to stop this before more damage was done, which meant she already knew damage existed. When I asked what exactly needed stopping, her answer came too carefully. And that restraint told me more than fury would have, because innocent people do not sound rehearsed when the truth arrives. Marin brought me the screenshots, the text chain, and the housing file in one folder, and each piece fit too neatly beside the next to leave room for misunderstanding. Judith had fed Piper the framing points before the video went live. Piper had repeated them almost word for word. And the apartment Judith called her home had been funded through a donor-restricted housing allowance. I read every page without rushing, then looked back at Piper's face frozen mid-tears on the screen, and understood exactly why they had chosen emotion over records. I did not respond publicly because timing mattered more than indignation. And their mistake was still widening while they talked. The longer Piper kept speaking, the more statements she attached to accounts, dates, and property records I could disprove with a single release. So I let the family keep building its own trap in full view, knowing that once lies leave fingerprints on documents, they stop being gossip and start becoming liability. By late afternoon, the family's version of me had already started traveling faster than the truth, which was exactly why I refused to answer it with outrage, tears, or self-defense. I had Marin set up a short live statement from the conference room instead of the chairman's suite because I wanted the setting to feel procedural, not theatrical. When I sat down in a plain white blouse with 4 folders aligned in front of me, I was not trying to look wounded, only organized enough to let paper do what emotion never could. I opened by telling the audience they did not owe me sympathy and that I had no interest in performing pain for strangers who had only been given one family's edited version. Then I lifted the first folder and walked through the trust documents, the succession filings, and the board record confirming that controlling authority had been mine before I ever married Grant Holloway. I set those pages down and moved straight to the second folder, where the draft transition memo and unauthorized council meeting proved that my removal had been planned before Brooke Dalton ever opened her mouth. By then, the comments had already started turning because documents have a way of stripping romance out of lies, especially when dates line up cleanly and signatures stay consistent. I opened the third folder and showed the housing records tied to donor-restricted funds, then explained that the apartment Judith Holloway described as her family home had been supported through an allowance never meant for private entitlement. I did not raise my voice when I said I had not removed innocent people from anything, because the financial file in front of me was already specific enough to do that work. The last thing I played was the recording, and I chose only the shortest section because one clear sentence lands harder than a long defense ever will. Grant's voice came through the speaker, calm and familiar, outlining the plan to force me out first and pressure the trust afterward. And the room behind the cameras went still before the internet did. I turned the recorder off, closed the final folder, and told everyone that if they were going to judge me, they should at least do it with the full record in front of them, then ended the live before anyone could mistake truth for performance. The next morning, I did not call an emotional town hall or deliver a speech about betrayal, because the live disclosure had already shifted public opinion and restored the record. What remained was the harder part, which was separating panic from culpability and deciding exactly who had crossed from loyalty into misconduct. Marin and outside counsel had already organized the files by conduct, not rumor, so every name on my list was attached to a record, a transfer, an approval, or a deliberate omission. I stood before the senior staff and read the decisions in the plainest language I had, because precision carries farther than anger when consequences need to hold. Those who altered internal records, approved restricted funds for private benefit, or funneled information to Brooke Dalton without authorization were terminated for cause effective immediately. Those whose conduct triggered regulatory exposure were placed on leave pending referral. And the silence that followed each name told me the room understood exactly why nobody was interrupting. Brooke lost her position first because the evidence against her was the cleanest, with the personnel drafts, donor messaging, and unauthorized coordination, all tying back to her hands. Piper Sloan received a formal demand through counsel before noon, requiring removal of the false statements, preservation of her communications, and response to the claims she had amplified. Judith Holloway was ordered to vacate the apartment, supported through donor-restricted housing funds. And that directive carried more weight than outrage because the ledger had already stripped away her last defense. Grant's case moved on a separate track, but not a softer one, because his suspension had already become formal removal and the board had authorized full cooperation with every internal review. I did not feel triumph while the system closed around each person who had helped build the trap. Only a steadier kind of quiet that had been missing from me for years. By the end of that day, everyone who had mistaken proximity for immunity had learned the same lesson, which was that once their conduct became documentation, consequences no longer needed my anger to arrive. After the removals were finalized, the building grew quieter in a way I had once imagined would feel victorious. But when it finally arrived, it felt cleaner than triumphant. The noise was gone. The lies had names attached to them. And yet the first thing I noticed was not relief, but how long I had lived braced for impact. For 3 years I had mistaken endurance for peace, shrinking my voice, softening my edges, and calling it maturity when it was really survival dressed well enough to pass. I saw Brooke one evening in the lower garage, standing beside her car with the drained face of someone who had finally run out of stories to tell herself. She asked whether I had ever truly loved Grant, and I told her I had. But love does not make deceit less deliberate or turn ambition into innocence. She looked at the concrete instead of at me then. And that silence mattered more than her question, because she had already seen the files, proving he never told her the whole truth either. Later that night, Judith sent a message without accusation, without bargaining, and without the family name wrapped around it like armor, which was the first honest thing she had given me. I read it once, set the phone down, and did not answer. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because not every apology needs access to the life it wounded. When I walked into my apartment and turned the lights on immediately, instead of standing in the dark with my thoughts, I understood something simple and final. I did not need to defeat anyone anymore, because I was no longer abandoning myself just to keep other people comfortable. A week later, the remaining Holloway shares formally went to market, and the notice landed on my desk with all the cold finality of a door closing from the other side. Several private equity groups were already circling, not because they cared about the institution, but because weakened families always attract people who mistake fracture for opportunity. I told Marin to prepare the buyout strategy immediately, because I had not fought my way through deception, removal, and public smearing just to leave a crack open for strangers. Grant called that evening after the offer was drafted, his voice steadier than before, but emptied of the confidence that used to make every compromise sound reasonable. He said people would call it a hostile takeover if I moved that quickly, and I answered that I no longer made decisions around narratives built by people who had lied first. He went quiet for a second, then accepted it with a tired kind of clarity. And that mattered only because it was the first time he sounded like a man without leverage. The final signing happened on an ordinary morning, with legal counsel across the table, transfer papers aligned in front of me, and no audience left to perform for. I signed for the remaining shares in one clean motion, then looked through the glass toward the department where I had spent 3 years pretending smallness was grace. When I stood up from that table, The institution was fully mine to protect. The last road back had closed. And for the first time, the future felt like something no one else could touch. Thank you for staying with me through this story and carrying its weight with such quiet grace. If it touched something real in you, leave your thoughts below and stay close. I hope you find the kind of love that feels peaceful, steady, and finally safe.